Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. We just came back from the unveiling of the plaque for This Little Light of Mine mural that was done at the University Plaza. It's fantastic. It's beautiful. He did an awesome job, and we thank Eric very much for that. Next on the agenda is a proclamation, two proclamations actually. The first one is Transgender Day of Remembrance. I need to get Michael Jones up here, please. My admin assistant was very kind to me and printed in a larger type so I could actually see it. The proclamation is Transgender Day of Remembrance, November 20th, 2018. Whereas Transgender Day of Remembrance was founded in 1999 by Gwendolyn Ann Smith, a transgender woman and activist who wished to memorialize the 1998 murder of Rita Hester. Rita Hester was a member of the transgender community of Allston, Massachusetts, and was fatally stabbed 20 times in her apartment. Her murder to this day remains unsolved. And whereas since its inception, Transgender Day of Remembrance has been held annually on the 20th of November and has evolved from a web-based project into an international day of action. Transgender Day of Remembrance is an opportunity to remember the trans and gender diverse individuals who have been murdered as a result of hate and will most likely otherwise be forgotten, to raise awareness and provide support and hope. And whereas in 2018, advocates recorded at least 28 deaths of trans and gender diverse people in the United States due to fatal violence, and at least 369 murders worldwide, constituting an increase of 44 murders compared to 2017. Most of these murders occurred in Brazil, 167, Mexico, 71, the United States, 28, and Colombia, 21. Since 2008, when tracking initiatives began, 2,982 known murders within 72 countries have been documented. And whereas trans and gender diverse people are victims of horrifying hate and violence daily, including extortion, physical and sexual assaults, and murder, transphobia overlaps the other axis of oppression prevalent in society, such as racism, sexism, and anti-sex worker sentiment and discrimination. Of those murdered worldwide, most affected are sex workers, 62%. In the United States, most affected are trans women of color and Native American trans women, 85%. Transgender women survivors of hate violence are more likely to experience police violence, physical violence, discrimination, harassment, sexual violence, threats, and intimidation compared to others. And whereas the City of Hagerstown is fully committed to the safety, well-being, and health of all citizens and of all the people, the commemoration of Transgender Day of Remembrance is an expression of this commitment and a reminder that trans and gender diverse people are our sons, daughters, parents, friends, and family. Now therefore be it resolved with the support of the City Council, I, Robert E. Brucci II, Mayor of the City of Hagerstown, Maryland, do hereby proclaim November 20th, 2018 as Transgender Day of Remembrance in Hagerstown and encourage all citizens to work toward ending all forms of violence against others.
Just thank you, Mr. Mayor, for issuing the proclamation today. The candlelight vigil will be on the public square tonight at 6 o'clock. Between 6 and 7. And only thing I would like to point out is that the 62% sex worker classification is that high because oftentimes transgender people are forced out of employment and the only means to make ends meet is in that area. And again, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I also have a proclamation for Small Business Saturday. Amanda? And several other people. All right, proclamation for Small Business Saturday, Saturday, November 24th, 2018. Whereas the City of Hagerstown believes that small businesses are the backbone of our local economy, generating jobs and improving the quality of life for citizens. And whereas the City of Hagerstown supports the efforts of local businesses and recognizes the critical role they play in our community to create jobs, boost our local economy, and preserve our neighborhoods. And whereas Small Business Saturday is a nationwide campaign to cultivate business for merchants of small businesses on the Saturday after Thanksgiving. And whereas Small Business Saturday will stimulate economic growth locally for merchants by following the addition of Black Friday and Cyber Monday, two of the busiest shopping days of the year. And whereas residents of our community and communities across the country are being asked to support small businesses and merchants on Small Business Saturday and throughout the year. Now therefore, with the support of the City Council, I, Robert E. Brucci II, Mayor of the City of Hagerstown, do hereby recognize Saturday, November 24th, 2018 as Small Business Saturday and encourage residents to recognize and support small businesses within our community by shopping at these establishments on the Saturday following Thanksgiving. So, this coming Saturday, get off your butts, head downtown, head to small businesses, help support a family who runs a small business.
Sure. I just want to thank Katie Serio with Pretzel and Pizza, Matthew Chang from the Game Hub, and Eric Sarmiento with Float Regenerate. They are local downtown business owners who have invested, and I want to thank them as well as all local business owners who have invested in our community for Hagerstown.
I'm Katie. Hi. So Pretzel and Pizza Creations, just right around the corner from here. Of course, spend all your money at Best Buy, wherever all the big box stores on Friday, but definitely come try to see us, walk the cultural trail, enjoy the beautiful mural, all the beautiful things that downtown Hagerstown has to offer, and eat at my amazing restaurant.
And the Game Hub on Franklin Street, it's a board game and hobby shop. A lot of people don't know about us, but if you or family members are into hobby gaming, board games, trading cards, Dungeons and Dragons, that kind of stuff, I have a wide selection and a space to play. We do free events weekly to try and generate a community. So we're at 24 West Franklin. If you think anyone would be interested in my services, come check us out on Saturday.
I'm not going to pitch my business. I just wanted to thank everyone. It's quite refreshing to open up in downtown Hagerstown and have the city behind us. That's incredible. I really don't have a lot to say other than it's great working together with the city. We have a lot of plans for the future of our business, and the city is fully behind us.
He doesn't want to, showcase his business floating on his shirt. All right, get a picture here. Come here, guys. Come on in. Okay. Hi, Jill. Come on up. We're going to introduce our guest, Dr. Jim Klauber, the president of Hagerstown Community College. And you can tell from his accent that he is from the South.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jim Klauber. We had the opportunity to have lunch recently and to take a tour of downtown. And our conversation talked a lot about economic development and the importance of education and training and the connectivity between workforce development and economic development. So with that, I turn it over to Jim.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You're right. I was born and raised in the South, but as I'm quick to point out, now living in Maryland, I'm only half Southern. My mother was actually from the eastern part of Maryland, all of her people came from Maryland and Delaware, and growing up, we used to come up to Delaware every year to visit with my grandparents. So yeah, I have the accent, but only half of the bloodline. I want to talk with you a little bit about some efforts that we're working on at the college. I think that certainly to make you aware, one is a workforce development program called WorkKeys, which is an ACT product. What it is it's a nationally recognized workforce credential, basically a baseline credential that measures an individual's ability to read, do math, and locate information. And thousands of companies across the country have recognized the WorkKeys test as a way to better match the jobs that they have with the applicants that they get for a particular job. Companies who have used WorkKeys have seen a decline in their turnover rate for those positions. They've also seen an increase in safety, especially in manufacturing jobs, because you're better able to align skills with abilities when it comes to hiring. As soon as I got here, I noticed that Maryland was, no one uses WorkKeys, which really amazed me. And a lot of the states in the Northeast do not. But if you look at the rest of the country, the West, the South, the Midwest, they are rapidly moving to become what are called work-ready communities, where over 900 counties in the United States have now become certified work-ready communities where employers and providers like colleges and K through 12 institutions have embraced the WorkKeys assessment as a way to help students. We are going to do that here in Washington County, and it was something that I wanted to kind of undertake, and we found a lot of community buy-in. We've been working with the chamber, working with Washington County Public Schools, working with other stakeholders around the community, and what we really are going to seek to do is become the first work-ready community in Maryland. And what does that do for us? Well, one thing it does is it allows for when companies and site selectors are looking at communities, with a point and click, they can go and see the quality of workforce in each individual community, because all of that is registered and recorded at ACT and put on their websites. So it helps in economic development. Is it the be-all, end-all? Well, no, it's not this magic silver bullet, but it's yet another arrow in the quiver of economic developers should have when they're looking at their arsenal of what they need to go out and try and bring jobs into the community. The other aspect about it is it gives that adult learner who's out there, maybe they don't have a high school diploma, they are looking to improve their career or find a career track to go into. They can come to us, and through their adult basic education program that we provide, which is federally funded and free to the student, we can provide them with workforce training that pairs that WorkKeys test, which is called the National Career Readiness Certificate, pairs that with career training. And our goal is to try and find areas in computer information sciences, allied health, and advanced manufacturing to try and help adult learners and try and get them into a career pathway where they can go and find a meaningful job and career for themselves. Some folks don't, it's not in their life view or life goal to go and get a college degree. And I'm good with that. I want them to go get a career. I want them to get something that's rewarding for them, themselves, and their families. Whatever that is, I'll help them get there. And that's what I see our mission is at the community college, is we're here to help the community reach those career goals, whatever they might be. And we think that WorkKeys is a critical component of that. And so, we're kind of embarking on this effort, and want to make sure that you're aware of it. Wanted to come and introduce myself to the ones of you I've not met yet or spent some time with yet, and tell you also that, I hope that we are able to work together and have a good partnership with the college. We're working over, and I told Jill about it, I said, we're working on our business incubator over at the college, and, we want the city to be our partner with that. If we get tenants into our incubator, within the first month, I don't want to be in the commercial real estate business. I want to be in the incubation business. Within that first month, I want folks from the city talking to our tenants and working on that exit plan so that they know what benefits and what programs and what other amenities the city of Hagerstown has to offer so that we can spin them out and have them come here. Because I think that certainly is our purpose, to serve the community, and we can really serve the community well in that Center for Business and Entrepreneurial Studies that we're currently under renovation right now. So I'm looking forward to it, looking forward to working with y'all, and subject to your questions, I want to thank you for having me here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim, have you ever given thought, and I know that you haven't been here that long yet, but to putting an extension of HCC in downtown?
Mayor, I've thought about it, and it certainly is something that we should consider at some point. I think the challenge for us at the college is that so much of especially with the new generation of student, that by and large, a lot of their courseware they want to be able to take in an online format. I mean, every semester we start to see the number of students wanting to take an online class grow. I mean, just today our board met and we shelved a project that had been on our capital improvement plan for an academic building, because the truth of the matter is that by the time we got to the year where we would have funded that in the future, I'm just not really sure that we would have needed it. And
right.
The thing is if we can offer a high quality online experience to a student where they can take the class at 2 in the morning in their pajamas, just as easily as they can coming to class, then that's certainly where we need to meet the student where they are. Now, not everybody's going to go to an online world. Listen, I'm the first one. I'd never take an online class. I'm 20th century. I want that face-to-face experience. But I understand we're working with a whole new generation of students who don't see things that way. I mean, I look at my children. Oh my gosh, they're in that generation, and they love that computer screen. So, it's a real challenge for us when you're talking about square footage and things like that. What I do see us doing, though, I see us partnering with entities like the library and others in the community to, especially as we get work keys going and testing, to be able to provide testing services for those learners who want to take the National Career Readiness Certificate, take that work keys test. And, there may be some adult education opportunities for us in that work keys curriculum to try and help those individuals who want to improve their scores. So I won't say the door is closed, but I will say that learners are changing, and the way that we address them, capital needs in terms of classroom space are becoming less and less.
Yeah. It's a good answer. I concur. So.
Yes, sir.
Well, I'm excited about the work keys because, we are partnering with P&G over in Martinsburg to put together some stuff that we can do here in Hagerstown to get our people here ready and in a job fair and be able to apply and do those kind of things. They got to hire 1,000 people, and that's just for P&G. And there's all these ancillary companies that they're already talking to. Because face it, P&G doesn't make cans.
That's right.
So, hopefully there's a little bit of economic development we might get in Washington County there, but there's definitely job opportunities for our people, and that's what's important.
Yes, sir. I know, Mayor, you all have been meeting with them. I went over and met with them. It's amazing. They are looking at, what they look for to hire in their workforce are the credentials that I want us to be offering embedded in our training at the college. National Career Readiness Certificate, you look at, they want quality training, so Lean Six Sigma, Yellow Belt training. If we can get them a manufacturer standard skills certification, certified production technician certification, if we can provide a workforce with those basic certifications, companies like P&G will fall on themselves to hire them. And here's the other thing. As I've noticed, I went in the 6 months I've been here, I've been to meet people all over Washington County, here in Hagerstown and outside. the employers and have talked with a lot of them, especially ones that are in manufacturing, and contrary to popular belief, manufacturing is not dead, and it's not dead in Hagerstown. There are a lot of small mom and pop manufacturers, and working with those individuals to take students maybe in the 1s or 2s and work them into maybe apprenticeships where they're working in those jobs while they're getting the skills training they need with us, can create long-term employees for those local manufacturers. And those are some things that we really want to start working on with our employers. And important thing, I think, for the college is that we have continuous dialogue with our employers and make sure that the skills we're training are what they need. And also our other educational partners like the Barr Institute, Purdue, USMH, all of them, to make sure that we're putting the right students in the right career tracks to go where they need to go.
Sounds exciting. So. All right, Jim, thank you very much for your
Thanks,
time.
sir. Appreciate it.
Have a good Thanksgiving.
Okay, you too.
Rodney, Stormwater Advisory Committee status update.
Good afternoon. With me is David Bolova with Wood, the consulting firm that we engaged with back in January to study the stormwater program that we currently have as it is, and then look at the program that we need to have to comply with our new state permit from MDE that regulates the quality and the quality of the stormwater runoff from the city. They have been exceptional to work with. They have experience in a lot of different communities, and they can draw from that as we work on this about, well, this community did it this way, this community did it that way, and I really appreciate that about David and Elizabeth Treadwell is also here. They just really were very helpful and very well prepared in putting together the information for us. And when I say us, I'm referring to the staff, but also the Stormwater Advisory Committee that is mentioned in my memo. And several of those folks are here, and I'd like to mention them. Paul Fry, Sean Griffith, Margaret Yockey, and Chris Hallett. And if I'm missing anybody, I apologize. But they were just excellent, too. They just were so engaged and asking good questions that kept us grounded. And they brought their perspectives, as you can see, the different parts of the community they were representing. They brought those perspectives to our discussions. We met 7 times, and we're kind of working this into a final form, a framework of what we want to present to you in another month or so. And this is kind of an update and to get your input before we finalize our work. But basically tonight is just information, and I'm going to turn it over to David, and he's going to walk you through what we've been working on the last 7 months, and then we can go from there.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I'm David Bolova with Wood Environment and Infrastructure Solutions, and it is a real pleasure to be here with you all this evening. And as Rodney mentioned, we've been working with city staff and also the Stormwater Advisory Committee since May, and I think that was the last time I got to meet with you, Mr. Mayor, is when you swore those individuals in. And so this is an opportunity really to touch base, get your feedback, get your questions, as we go into the final phases of this part of the stormwater utility fee study. And so tonight what I want to do is I want to give a quick overview of the process, a bit about how we came up with the proposed program to be able to push the city of Hagerstown forward and what the drivers are behind that. I think that's the most important thing. And then look at the funding assessment that we performed and some of the findings and recommendations of the Stormwater Advisory Committee to date. While there are no decisions that are being made tonight, we can touch at the end about kind of what those next steps are. And also, if I start talking in jargonese or use phrases that you don't know, please feel free to go ahead and stop me. I'm going to go through as quickly as possible, but I also don't want to throw out an acronym here and there and have you wondering what on earth is this guy talking about. So feel free to stop me. So I know there's a lot more to the story when it comes to stormwater management in the city, and I think you'll see that as the presentation goes through, but it is worth backing up a little bit and thinking about why are we here today and why did the City Council ask for this study in the first place. And it really comes down to meeting the new Maryland Department of Environment requirements for cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay by the year 2025. And so that's really kind of the framework that we're operating under. And so as you may know, Maryland is committed to doing that. The three main pollutants are phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment. Urban stormwater runoff, so urban areas are a major source of that pollution. And within your urban areas, the biggest contributor of that are impervious areas. And so things like your rooftops, your parking lots, your streets, and things like that. In your municipal separate storm sewer system permit, which you've operated for a while, there's always been goals in order to reduce those pollutants or any pollutants to the maximum extent practicable. The new permit that you had adopted in this last October is the first time that that permit actually contains very specific measurable targets that you have to achieve within a certain period of time. And so that's what's ultimately driving being at the table, because it's a pretty big lift, and we'll go through that. Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, New York, they're all kind of in the same boat, and they've all come up with their own different plans for how to achieve this, but they're similar in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. Now, Maryland, the way that they're looking at doing this within their urban areas is to require a percentage treatment of untreated impervious area. And so you got to think about it this way, which is you've got a certain amount of impervious area in the city of Hagerstown. A certain amount of that is already treated because you've had development or you've had redevelopment, and stormwater management facilities and practices already treat those things. And what Maryland is saying is that once you've subtracted those out, you have to put the practices in place to treat 20% of that currently untreated impervious surface. So simple enough in terms of how you figure that out, but it's a pretty big lift, as I went ahead and mentioned. And so I think this map gives you a good idea of the order of magnitude of what we're talking about. And so in the red are the impervious areas in the city of Hagerstown. And so you'll see that's mostly streets, but it's also parking lots and buildings. And in the gray are your currently treated areas. And so taking a look at that, you will notice that that's primarily new development that occurred after the most recent standards were put into place with Maryland's 2000 Stormwater Management Handbook. And so by and large, although there are exceptions, things that were developed before that weren't treated to a modern standard, and so those are the areas that are currently untreated. So that 20% for Hagerstown is pretty large, and it's larger than a lot of your more recently developed localities for those reasons. So with that as a backdrop, City Council's mandate to the advisory committee and to us and to staff was actually a bit broader than that, and I think that's a good thing. And so you basically said, hey, we know this is one thing that's going to drive some major change into the city, but let's take the time to look back at our entire program. Let's think about it comprehensively. What are the things that we're going to ultimately need in order to have a successful stormwater management program? And then we take a look back and see what kind of funding options are out there in order to fund that program from the long term. So something that's adequate and sustainable in order to go ahead and meet your long-term needs. We've tackled that in 3 phases, and so we are wrapping up the first phase right now. And so that phase, again, starts with the public input, and so that's the Stormwater Advisory Committee. A program assessment, and so we're looking at what is the program now, what is the program that we're going to have in the near future, and then what are those funding options, and what are our recommendations for moving forward. If you decide to move forward with the concepts and findings of the advisory committee, then we go into phase 2. And so that is really getting into some of the policy decisions and policy needs, really looking at what the rates are that are out there, and then ultimately developing a draft ordinance that would implement a stormwater utility fee. And so we really have kind of 2 places in this process where you can say yes or no. And so we're coming up on one now, which is the end of phase 1, going into phase 2, where we'd spend the resources to really get into the weeds about how we'd implement this. And then ultimately there's a trigger point at the end where you'd adopt an ordinance and move on to implementation. So Rodney did a great job of describing the Stormwater Advisory Committee. They have been really critical to the process. And so as we were moving into it, really we were asking them to do two things. The first one is, what is the stormwater program that we need in order to not only meet those external challenges, I mean, the mandates are very, very important, but you also have needs and issues that are local. And so we want to make sure that actually those take priority. And that we're achieving both of them. And then they really got into the how do we go ahead and ultimately fund this. And so these are individuals who now can join any consulting firm across the United States, and they can throw out all these acronyms too. But they did a really, really great job. As Rodney mentioned, it was a very broad group, and this was done on purpose. To make sure that we were getting the collective feedback of a range of different groups. And so not only did we have environmental and business groups, but we also had nonprofits, and we also had faith-based communities that were involved. So in terms of the assessment process, there are really three main areas that we looked at. And so we had the program development. And again, this is kind of looking under the hood about what it is that you're currently doing. We had some very in-depth interviews with your staff about what's working, what's not working, what keeps you up at night. And then we looked at, what are those drivers, how much do they cost, and then ultimately we had to prioritize those. I mean, you can come up with a list that's this long, but we felt it was really important to come up with the top priorities for what we were looking at. The data assessment, and so if you are looking at a user fee that's based on impervious area, you need to make sure that your mapping and your geographic information systems are robust enough to support something like that. And so this is something we did behind the scenes, but we did report back out to the SAC and say, hey, you actually have a pretty robust system. Like any system, there's going to be some cleanup that's ultimately going to be needed, but yes, you do have the data systems in place in order to support a stormwater user fee or a stormwater utility. And then at the end of that, you have the funding options assessment. And so that's when we look at the program cost, what are your financial assumptions, and we put together rate and cost models in order to be able to compare what is the impact of those different funding options on the residents and the businesses in the city of Hagerstown. Okay, so going back to our key drivers, and so I want to touch just a couple moments on the major areas that we focused on that are the cost drivers for change in the city of Hagerstown. And so when you looked at that map of the impervious areas in the city and the treated and untreated part, city staff has gone through the analysis to figure out what does that really mean in terms of acres that need to be treated. And so what are the real acres that you actually have to go out there and retrofit with stormwater management facilities? And so that's about 450 acres of impervious area that has to be treated. So that's a pretty large amount when you go ahead and think about that. The real challenge is trying to figure out how much is that going to cost, because the cost to treat an impervious acre is highly variable. And so you think about it, you have some sites that you might be able to do on public property where there aren't the acquisition costs. Some sites you might have conflicts with different utilities. And so there's a lot of stuff that goes in with respect to how much is this going to cost. Geology in the city is another one. But if you take a look at what's been done in the region, what a lot of the studies say, a solid conservative estimate is about $60,000 per impervious acre treated. And so that comes out to just some very simple math, which is $27 million in capital improvements that you'll need before the year 2025, which is the deadline under your permit for achieving these things. Just to be able to juxtapose that against what your current capital budget is for stormwater, your current CIP is about $1.1 million per year. The majority of that is assumed to come from grants and other sources, which may or may not materialize. And when you think about the fact that we have 90 other municipalities in Maryland that are dealing with the same similar issues, you can imagine there's going to be a lot more competition for a limited amount of grant funding that's out there. These are just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, just to help illustrate in your mind what these look like. And so these are actual recent projects that the city has implemented, and the neat thing is that these projects help to reduce the amount of area that you're having to retrofit now. So they're very good investments. But this is a buyer retention facility up at Clean Water Circle, and so it drains 14.2 acres of impervious area, and so that's pretty good. take a look at how much space that takes just to go ahead and treat 14.2 acres. And so that's going to be a rarity in the city when you're going to have that much land that's going to be available. And so most of your facilities or most of your practices you're going to be able to put in place are going to be smaller than that, and they're not going to be as much, the economies of scale aren't going to be as great. Here's another one. So this is a Hager's Park bioswale, impervious area treated 7.2 acres. And so just to give you an idea of the cost for those, so those two projects together came out to $625,000. And so that was a mix of city and grant funding. And that comes out to about $30,000 per impervious acre. But you have to remember, there were very few conflicts. There was a lot of easy access, and those were all on public property. So, you know, again, that gives you a kind of a benchmark point for if all the stars align, you can get it down to something like 30, but it's likely to be more expensive as we move forward. Okay. So another issue that we honed in on comes down to the inspection and maintenance of the structural stormwater practices that are being put in place or have been put in place. And so over your many years of implementing a stormwater management ordinance, whether it's new development or whether it's redevelopment or whether it's voluntary retrofits, you have put in a pretty extensive infrastructure of stormwater quality management facilities. And so currently there is 276 of these structures on 192 properties. 240 of those are privately maintained. And so under your MS4 permit and also under state law, the city is responsible for inspecting those. And so you inspect those once every 3 years. But if the inspection finds that there's work to be done, it's also up to the city to make sure that those maintenance agreements that you have with the private property owner are actually enforced. And so the issue that we were finding is that on average, you have about 10 new facilities that are being added to the city's coffers each year, that you are now responsible for making sure they're being inspected and maintained in perpetuity. At that pace, it's likely that work is going to outstrip current staff's ability to go ahead and manage that. And so one of the cost drivers in here is making sure we get the resources in place in order to augment city staff to do that. Now, since it's once every 3 years, we thought that it's probably not something you would necessarily need a new staff person for. It's something that could be contracted out, and so we assumed that, although clearly once you get to that point, you can decide whether that's a piece of a city employee or whether you indeed want to go ahead and contract that out. Aging stormwater management system. Most of your stormwater management system was actually installed back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And so when you take a look at a picture of the city of Hagerstown back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, it's quite a bit different than it is today. But overall, the city manages about 106 miles of storm drain pipe, and a good chunk of that is now 100 years or older. And so that presents an infrastructure issue, and it's not unique to the city of Hagerstown. As localities have developed, they put stormwater infrastructure, goes underground, and you react to it when it starts to fall apart or collapse. Now, one of the things that we were looking at is, hey, can we switch from a reactive model where you're waiting for something to actually collapse or fall apart, in which case you've got road closure, you've got the potential for damage to public infrastructure or private property, and move from that and switch to a more proactive approach. And what would that ultimately go ahead and take? And so there's been a number of localities in the region that have some pretty good data about the cost of replacing by emergency versus rehabilitating something before you have that emergency. And so Fairfax County, Virginia, for instance, has a good deal of information that shows that it's about 9 times more expensive to react after you've had that collapse than it is to go in and rehabilitate something before that actually occurs. Now, like anything, in order to go from a reactive to a proactive approach, that requires some kind of investment up front. And so in this case, that investment would be to actually go in with closed circuit television, look through your storm drain pipes, and get a sense of what are the conditions of your facilities or your infrastructure, so that then you could go ahead and target your resources to where it will mean the most and prevent those failures by emergency from occurring. So again, that's pretty variable, but working with staff and looking at some of the resources nationwide, that's about $12,000 per linear mile using a contractor. Just so you can get an idea of what we're talking about, so this is a collapsing pipe in the city of Hagerstown. And so this is something that if you use closed circuit television, you'd be able to figure it out before it actually collapsed. But this is something that is going to create a sinkhole, or it's going to wind up damaging private property if it's allowed to continue to deteriorate. To give you an idea of what the rehabilitation looks like, and so one of the common technologies is something called cured in place. And so this is again from Fairfax County. The picture over to your left, you've got the joint separating on the concrete pipe. And they go ahead and take that resin and they shoot it through, and it stabilizes the pipe system and gives it new life. So that's the kind of technology we were looking for. But this is what we're trying to avoid, which is the localized flooding. And so this is in the city of Hagerstown. I think this is Pennsylvania Avenue, correct? Yeah. And so, the flooding can be caused from a lot of different things. It could be caused from a collapsed pipe. It could be caused from clogging. It can be caused because the system is simply undersized. But you don't know these things until you actually go in and figure out what is the root cause for that flooding, or what is it that is likely going to happen over the next couple of years. And the last one that we focused in on was roadway, curb, and sidewalk maintenance, and the fact that that's currently the responsibility of the private property owner. And so it's not unique to the city of Hagerstown, but it is relatively rare that you would treat something that is oftentimes considered a public asset and put responsibility for the maintenance of that on the private property owner. And so in this case, curb and gutter is considered a part of the drainage system. And so it is something that if you decided to move forward with a utility fee or even any other funding option, you could go ahead and bring that into your stormwater program and treat it as a part of your stormwater asset. And so staff estimates that would be about $100,000 per year in order to go ahead and do that. They don't think that it would take any additional staff, and the reason is because you already have staff who helps out private property owners to help engage them with how to replace that. That person would just simply be shifted over to managing a larger contract, and you'd probably get some economies of scale because now you're working on a citywide basis rather than on a property-by-property basis. The orphan in this is what do you do with the sidewalk repair, because that is not part of your storm drainage system. And so whether that would be covered under the general fund or some other approach is a policy decision that the city council would have to make. So in terms of the priorities that the advisory committee brought out, and so their number one priority was, we have to go ahead and meet the regulatory mandates that are contained in your MS4 permit. And so that's both the 20% treatment requirement as well as maintaining and inspecting those stormwater facilities. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that that MS4 permit ramps up responsibilities in a number of other different areas. And so it's not that we're just have these two areas and everything else is the same. If you look at illicit discharge detection and elimination, where's your dumping, where's your illicit pollution sources, all those things are things that the city is going to have to do that are extra. As part of that, though, with the SAC's priorities, they really focused on two things, and I think these are key, which is when you're picking projects in order to meet that 20% goal, you need to, where possible, pick projects that have multiple objectives or meet multiple objectives. And so if you have something that can meet both water quality, but can also reduce flooding or improve local aquatic habitats, you want to prioritize those projects. The other one is creating an incentive program that helps to facilitate public-private partnerships. And this just gets down to the simple fact that you don't have enough public property in the city in order to get to that 20% level mark, at least not efficiently. And so there's going to be private property that you can retrofit and more efficiently get there. And so if you are able to create those public-private partnerships through an incentive program, you can create a win-win situation. And the other two are shifting over time from a reactive operations and management strategy to a proactive one, and then shifting the cost of curb and gutter to the stormwater management program. Yes, sir.
Curb and gutter, I just want to make sure I understand what we're talking about. When we're not talking about sidewalks.
Correct.
When we talk about gutter, can you make sure I understand what we're talking about with gutter?
Yeah, so it's the curb and it's the part that interfaces with the street where the
Okay.
water would run.
Okay.
Yeah.
Question, why couldn't the sidewalk be covered under this program?
Because there's not a strong enough nexus between the sidewalk and what the goals of a stormwater program. And so the stormwater
Matter
program,
of fact-
it's a user fee.
Right. Sidewalk is an impervious.
Yeah, it's
Doesn't
yeah,
help
yes,
us.
right, right.
I'm
So-
sorry, what's that again?
It's impervious, you'd want to get rid of sidewalks and not put them in.
Well, you have to treat the impervious area.
Right.
So then why wouldn't it be covered under a stormwater management fee?
Why would paying for sidewalks help out stormwater management? The gutter, I understand, controls where your water's going.
So we want to get rid of sidewalks.
Well, no, we don't want to get rid of sidewalks, obviously, but,
don't want the
but it's an impervious surface. It's not something
Sure it
that's,
is.
that's
Yeah.
helping
You
things.
get credit for that?
If you took off impervious,
No. You get
The gutter.
credit for, curb and gutter. As part of the MS4, was that one of the items that you get credit toward the 20% threshold?
no, not unless you are
So
treating. the
why
curb.
why would we include an item, in other words, why would we charge folks? I get it that the argument could be made that the gutter pan is really part of, mill and overlay projects, et cetera. But if it's not actually, I wouldn't spend any money
Right.
in this type of program that I would charge people for that would not generate something toward meeting that 450 acres worth of credit.
I tend to agree.
And so hopefully I'm understanding the question. You're not charging anybody for public sidewalk or public curb and gutter.
No, but we're generating money. In other words, if we go through with this, and I feel like, you know, that all I've talked about is MS4 anymore between this and the other jurisdictions. But if we go through with this, you're going to be generating money.
Correct.
And just like your water or your sewer utility generates money, and then that money is then reinvested in that utility, really the state's trying to make storm drain be treated like a utility. And so my question is, they gave us this criteria and said, you know, if you do all of these different things, you get, you know, a formula of credit applied to each of them. What I'm asking is curb and gutter replacement one of those items in that criteria that gives you credit
Right.
toward meeting the 450 acres
So-
that we have?
Correct, and it is not.
Right.
And it comes down to what is it that you treat the infrastructure as a utility? And so when you think about wastewater treatment, it has a quality aspect, and so you're treating the effluent, and it has a collection aspect.
Yeah,
And those are all part of the fee that you pay for wastewater. And so that's the idea, is that yes, you absolutely could have a stormwater utility that only focused on stormwater quality. What the advisory committee was saying is, hey, we need to look at the system as a whole and make sure that the system is operated effectively.
But the priority of that funding should be directed toward achieving that 450 acre goal by 2025, as the state has generally mandated. In other words, I wouldn't spend, over the course of that time, let's say we enacted it next year, that's 5 years, that's $500,000. I would never spend $500,000 toward an item that didn't apply some of that credit, because the goal of the state is to try and make you achieve that 20% credit as soon as practical.
Correct, and that's a policy decision that the city council would need to make, is, you know, whether you focus solely in on the water
That's why I want to
quality
understand
aspect.
if I got any credit for it, because I
Right, yeah,
wouldn't spend.
yeah, it's a matter of how you want to look at your stormwater program.
It basically comes down to if we want to take the cost of replacing curb and gutter off the property owners.
Which
this
I
is
think
an
the whole
opportunity to do
separate
that.
subject,
Yeah.
as it
is.
applies to our street overlay program,
And something we've
not,
looked at.
not as part of this MS4
We've looked at that issue at.
obligation.
Right.
Like, I feel like that's,
As a property owner, if you say, I don't have to ever worry about my curb and sidewalk anymore versus paying this fee, that might be a reasonable trade-off.
So in essence, in order to
No
achieve what the
way.
state wants us to achieve, we could just mill all the streets and put down a pervious.
no. In fact, one of the highest grade options that you can do in this whole process is connect septics. I mean, that's where you get your biggest bang for the buck, is connecting commercial and residential septic onto the public system.
For the nitrogen part.
That's right, you get like 0.9, so you get more toward the credit than anything else. If you got down to it, they don't want you stripping the streets down, they want everybody to get off private septic systems. I mean, that's the reality.
Which is a big issue for the county.
So, but anyways, the scope of your program is absolutely, you know, a policy issue that you'll need to consider. This gives you an idea of the proposed program that the advisory committee thought was reasonable to move forward. And so you'll see that it does include the city curb, it includes some money for going in and doing closed circuit television of your system, so you got a better sense of what it looks like. The main driver, though, is gonna be that capital in order to be able to get to that 20% retrofit requirement, as well as the staff that's gonna be necessary for that. And so that's one of those unknowns at this point, which is how much staff is it gonna take in order to oversee a capital investment that large, but it does include an additional FTE for an engineer to help manage that. But that gives you an order of the sense of magnitude, regardless of whether you have those other components in there. You're going from a program that's a little over $1 million per year to something that's in the $6 to $7 million per year. That's a lot. And so this was something that the SAC also discussed. And so there was a lot of focus on how do we reduce those costs. And so I think most of these are relatively self-explanatory. And so you want to continue to investigate what are those most cost-effective practices. To your point, there are things that are going to be more or less cost-efficient. Looking at those public-private partnerships. So, where do you have lots of private impervious area that might be able to be treated very cost-efficiently? Coordinating with Washington County, where there's economies of scale that might be had. There's localities, York County, Fairfax County, have all implemented regional ones. The one that I wanted to make sure that I touched on is the new water quality nutrient trading program that Maryland just adopted. And so if you're familiar with it, it just simply allows somebody to implement a stormwater practice elsewhere. They bank those credits and then they sell them on the open market. And then the city could purchase those rather than implementing structures or facilities right here locally. Now you lose the benefits of that structure, but it's got the potential to be cheaper in order to meet your stormwater requirements. Now what we don't know is what is that cost going to be, or what's the capacity of that program going to be in the next couple years leading up to 2025, because it's relatively new, and so it's kind of an unknown about how much you ultimately would be able to rely on that program in order to reduce your costs. But before we get into funding, any other questions about the program?
I have one, and it's the slide with the, I guess it's the key drivers to the aging storm drain system.
Yes.
I mean, by my estimation, you're looking at, you said about 106 miles of pipe, 4,000 storm drain inlets the city manages. And at $12,000 a mile, I mean, you're talking, and I guess this would be more of a suggestion, but that's about $1.3 million. I mean, you'd be way ahead, and I know a number of larger jurisdictions look at this, you'd be way ahead not to do a contractor. I mean, this isn't rocket science. Looking at the CCTV of the different drains, and especially for ones as large as the city has, to actually buy the equipment. I mean, the technology has advanced enough, we have enough personnel, you'd be able to basically buy this equipment and train your personnel, way cheaper than $12,000 a mile for a third-party provider to do that.
And the sewer department has that
Right.
technology right now.
Already.
It's just a matter of, do they have
We
the,
did a lot of that out on Northern Avenue.
yeah, whether they have the time to do 106 miles.
All I'm saying, I think you could hire 2 staff individuals, heck, at 1.3
Cheaper
million, you
than
could probably hire
1.2
4
million.
staff individuals
Yeah.
and be ahead of the game, TV it in 2 years of 4 full-time staff members at a third of the cost
Yeah, we talked about that.
for private.
And those are definitely things if you decide to move into phase 2. There's pros and cons to hiring staff versus contracting, depending on how long you think you're going to have to do this. And so those are the kind of things that we would really start to focus in on is what's the best way to implement this program. And I will say for the program costs, we did realize that it didn't make sense to inspect the entire 106 miles because some of that is relatively new. And so we did focus that down and prioritize the older areas of the city. And so that's not the whole 106. We're making sure that we're going in on the areas that are most likely to actually need that kind of investigation. Other questions or thoughts? Okay. So if you thought that was fun. All right, so again, the reason why we spent so much time on the program is that the program does drive all other decisions with respect to the rates. And so it's important to make sure that your program is driving those later decisions. And so in turning our attention, I think the important thing that we wanted to make sure that we highlighted is the question is not whether or not there will be cost impacts, but ultimately how are those cost impacts distributed among property owners in the city of Hagerstown. And so a couple of those program elements you may or may not decide you want to move forward with, but at least for the larger capital improvements that are associated with the regulatory requirements, the question isn't so much whether, it's how. And in Maryland, there's really two big ways of doing this. And so the first one is the real property tax. And so that's something you all are very, very familiar with. It's property value based. It does not generate money from legally tax exempt properties. And just so you gotta have an idea of what that means, there's about 502 tax exempt parcels in the city of Hagerstown. That's about 3.6% of the parcels, but it's about $5 million in unbilled revenue. It's a known quantity in terms of how you bill this. If you decided you wanted to move forward with the real property tax, you would simply increase the real property tax in order to go ahead and cover that need. User fee, on the other hand, is system impact based. And so that impact is based on the demand for, or the generation for the demand of services on the system. So, the whole need for the public system is generated by what goes on a piece of developed property. And so in this case, what you use is impervious area as the meter for being able to distribute those costs. Now, because it's a fee for service under Maryland state law, all properties pay. And so whether you're tax exempt or not, all properties will pay into it, just like they do for electricity, just like they do for other things. Another interesting aspect of a utility fee, a user fee, is that federal and other government properties also pay as long as you don't treat yourself any differently. And so if the city pays for your properties as a fee, then other governmental properties also have to pay. But if you exempt your own properties, they now have a case to say, well, that's not a fee as far as you're concerned, and they'll make the case for why they don't have to pay.
Does that apply to all users that, for lack of a better term, dump to your city-owned facilities?
Right, so it applies for any parcel in the city that has impervious cover.
But if it's
Right.
truly a utility, and there is, let's just say a shopping center, that dumps into a city-owned utility,
But
no
outside the
differently
city
than water and
limits.
sewer, why shouldn't the city be able to charge that user of that utility, whether they're inside or outside of the city?
Oh, inside or outside of the city itself.
I understand that we have a number to meet goal-wise for our pervious and impervious area, that 20% threshold.
Right.
What I'm saying, though, is once you make it a legal utility, just like a water user or a sewer user is charged for access to that city utility, so should anybody else that is accessing that utility, or we can basically shut the pipe off and they can redirect it somewhere else.
Right.
Whether they're in the city or not.
I mean, it's a utility at that point.
Right. And Elizabeth, I don't know if have we ever run into anything like that?
Is the question about properties outside the jurisdiction?
Yeah. And so typically, if you don't have jurisdiction over a parcel.
I get it, we
But-
serve
but-
80,000 customers on our water system.
Right.
We serve more customers outside of the city on water, I think, than inside of the city. We have some towns that are wholesale customers.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, if it's truly becoming a utility, just like those customers that we have outside of the city on our water system or our sewer system, those customers should pay for access to this utility that the city owns and maintains and has the responsibility to properly provide for.
Yeah, I think it's a,
But you don't have the responsibility to provide drainage outside the city.
That's what I'm saying, so do we have the ability then to say, you know what, we're gonna shut off this 18-inch main? If somebody's using, if that ultimately comes into the city's stormwater management pond, of the 192 structures, 176 structures that we have in the city,
right. So you're essentially saying if your stormwater is gonna be managed by our system.
if we've got to
you-
manage,
you-
yeah,
You pay, or you need to find somewhere else to go ahead.
we gotta
and put
find an
the stormwater.
alternative spot on site or redirect it to some other location.
Right. I'm not aware that that has ever been done, although I
I'm not
could be
aware that
wrong.
it's authorized.
Yeah.
I would go back to the state code.
And I think Elizabeth is right. That was the second thing I was
Well,
gonna say.
the
is
state code clearly defines that we're responsible to meet the pervious and impervious management of that area, within the jurisdiction.
Right.
But it says nothing to the effect that we can't charge as a utility provider for that new utility.
And there is specific authorizing language in the Code of Maryland that authorizes you to implement a stormwater user fee or a stormwater utility. And I would just have to take a look at how that is structured and how broad a power that would give the city, and see if that's available under the current enabling authority. And I can certainly get you the citation for what part of the Maryland code that's under.
But that's the kind of feedback we're looking for to wrap this up, so we'll look into that.
Yeah, okay. The last two pieces, credit or a fee reduction for existing stormwater management facilities. I'll talk about that later, but that's something that you can get under a utility as opposed to real property tax. And then, where I mentioned that if you were to use the real property tax, there's no additional billing infrastructure that you need to develop. For a stormwater utility, you do have to maintain your impervious areas, and you do need to make sure that there's a way to link that impervious area on a property to a billing system. And so there is a little bit more work that would be required in order to bill those properties properly. So within the user fee, so as we were looking through with the Stormwater Advisory Committee, there are three different ways of structuring a utility fee that we looked into. And these are by no means all of the different ways that you can do this, but they represent kind of your typical ways of doing this. And so the first one is where you charge all properties based on a fixed unit of impervious area. So regardless of the property type, you have something called a billing unit, and so in this case, we have a billing unit is 1,000 square feet of impervious cover. This is my lovely home right here to protect any other properties in Hagerstown. And so let's say my home is 2,500 square feet of impervious cover. Your billing unit is 1,000 square feet, so that comes out to 2.5 billing units. Usually you round up or down to whole billing units. That means my property is 3 billing units. You all set a rate per billing unit, and you multiply that by 3. That is what the property owner gets charged. Uniform across the board. Another common approach, although it's less common now than it used to be, it was really developed when geographic information and mapping systems weren't so robust. And so your profile of impervious cover, particularly on small residential parcels, wasn't as good, is something called an equivalent residential unit. And so in an equivalent residential unit, all single-family detached residential, and in Hagerstown, that would include row houses, not townhouses like in a common interest community, but it would include row houses. So they're all charged one billing unit. So they're all charged one rate. And then for all other properties, they are charged in billing units of the median amount of the single-family detached residential. So in this case, you've got my property there in the middle. You have my retirement cabin that I'm going to buy in 20 years from now. And then you have the mansion, I think that's Ariana Grande or somebody's mansion, that I will never be able to afford. But all of those would be charged the same rate. And then other properties would be charged based on billing units of 1,861. So that is the median amount of impervious area you have on your single-family residential detached lots.
Excuse me, when
Yeah.
you're speaking all other, are you talking about commercial then? or
You're talking about
non-resident?
anything that is not single-family residential detached. So it would be
Anything.
commercial, industrial, it would
Okay.
be apartment, condos.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the first example, the straight impervious rate basis
Uh-huh.
was again, all type of properties.
All
so-
type of properties.
Okay.
And so the big difference is here, you make it really simple for single-family detached residential, and then you charge all other properties based on that
Okay.
billing unit.
Just for clarity, all of this is two-dimensional, right?
Right.
So it doesn't matter if you're 15 stories high. What matters is what your box is two-dimensionally from
Correct.
the bird's eye.
And the only place where it gets a little bit more complicated is when you have property, when you got condos where you have ownership in layers. But there's ways to work through that, but you're correct, it's all two-dimensional. You're not, you're looking at your surface area. Now, for this one right here, you can see that that clearly creates some equity issues. My home has more impact with regard to stormwater quality and quantity than the cabin that I'm gonna own, but certainly less than that mansion. And so, that's something that you need to consider. It's simpler to administer, and certainly simpler because you don't have to worry about the exact impervious area on a property. But you're gonna have people looking at that and saying, well, is that equitable? And I'll show you kind of an example of how that works in Hagerstown. To get a little bit at that, there are also different tiered structures. And so in this case, single-family detached residential properties might be divided up into tiers. There's lots of different ways of doing that. For our example, we broke it down into 3 tiers. So you've got, 1 billing unit, 0.7 billing unit, 1.7, based on a breakdown of, logical breakdown of impervious area. And then all other impervious areas charged in a building unit. In this case, we made it simple with just 1,000 square feet. So it gets at a little bit of that equity issue, but you still are capping your larger properties in terms of what they ultimately would pay if they were to pay for all of their impervious area. And so to give you a kind of a picture of the distribution in Hagerstown, so this is your distribution of single-family detached residential based on impervious area. And so you can see it's kind of your typical bell curve. There are localities where this gets a little funky, where you might have a double bell curve or it's stretched out even further. But this gives you an idea of the distribution of properties that are in the city of Hagerstown. And so they're all, they're gathered there at that median, but you certainly have a healthy number that are below that number, and you've got a healthy number that are above that number. This is the same thing for non-single family detached residential. So this is all those other properties. And so you can see there's a real big cluster right there. And that represents the fact that as a whole, the city of Hagerstown has a lot of small businesses. And so they are clustered in that particular area. But you also have medium and larger parcels with a good amount of impervious cover. And so you can see that ultimately trails off where you've got the larger properties in there. And so again, under all of the scenarios, these ones are going to be charged based on their unit of impervious cover. It's these ones where you have different models where you decide whether or not you want more or less equity based on how precise the data is that you're going to be dealing with. So based on all that information, Elizabeth Treadway is the one who gets to sit down with our cost and rate models. And so we put together a model that looks at a number of different factors, and we use that to come up with estimated rates for comparative purposes. And so our rate model includes operating costs, it includes the capital costs, it includes the cost of money. And so in this case, because you have such a huge capital expense, that $27 million in a relatively short period of time, Elizabeth assumed that we would have a general obligation bond of over a 20-year period. And so that's built into that model. You got to look at cash flow, you got to look at reserves, you got to think about the fact that you're going to have some potential bad debt that's coming in. And then we have some key assumptions that are built in there. And so these are things that Elizabeth and city staff worked through. We wanted to make them realistic, but slightly on the conservative side. And so we want to assume that there's going to be relatively little interest earnings. We don't want to overappreciate that. We're going to assume that there's going to be relatively modest growth with respect to the increase in the number of billing units. And so that kind of gives you an idea of what goes into that. And so once you do that, this is what you get in terms of a comparison of the different approaches that we worked through with the Stormwater Advisory Committee. I want to start off, as you look through that, to go ahead and mention that point, or the 4.5 cents on the real property tax, that is for the entire program. So we wanted to be able to compare apples to apples. And so that 4.5 cents, that includes 2.9 cents of your existing program. And so you're already spending real property tax money on your existing program to the tune of about 2.9 cents. And so the increase that you would have to do to the real property tax in 2019 would be the delta on that. And you can see that delta grows considerably once you get out there to 2025, when the real property tax to support the entire program would be about 11 cents. 2.9 cents of that would be your existing program. But it gives you an idea of how all these things ultimately will go ahead and compare. And so you've got your rates, and then what we've laid out there is probably the more meaningful thing, which is what is the impact on the median property in a different category. And so you can see, for instance, for the utility, based on just a straight 1,000 square foot of impervious cover, your rate starting off would be $30 per billing unit for both single family and non-single family. Your average or your median number of billing units is going to be 2, and so your bill would be $60 for your median property owner in those 2 categories. A year. And so you can imagine, and we can run these in a million different ways, and we have, so you can see what the 25th percentile is and the 75th percentile, and you can get a sense of how these numbers start to differentiate themselves when you get into the higher brackets of impervious area. That's when you start to see the big difference. The thing that I think is going to be most useful for you, though, is what does this mean in terms of the overall shift in the distribution of costs? And so getting back to the premise that you're going to have to invest in infrastructure or capital, how does the methodology by which you choose to do that, to raise that money, shift the cost among property owners? And so you can see from the real property tax, just as an example, your commercial, industrial, and other starts off at 36% of that program. The program costs are borne by those, and those increase to about 50% if you're basing it on just their level of impervious area as opposed to the value of their property. And likewise, the amount of the program that's borne by single-family, detached, and other residential goes down. The part that is new, again, if you've got real property tax, City of Hagerstown doesn't buy into that, nor do tax-exempt properties. And so about 16% of the program would be picked up by those 2 categories if you were to go with a utility fee type approach. So I wanted to, as I'm starting to wrap up here, hit on stormwater fee credits, because this is something that is relatively unique to a stormwater utility fee, and it is also something that typically generates a lot of interest from the public at large. And so a credit is a reduction in a property owner's fee that recognizes that they've made an investment that they are operating and maintaining that is going to reduce costs to the program in the long term. And so it is actually required if you are to adopt a stormwater utility fee. The Code of Maryland says if you adopt a fee, you have to have a credit policy. That's all it says. You can structure it in any way that you see fit, although there has to be a nexus between the fee and the benefit to the program. So you can't just arbitrarily say we're going to give somebody 50% off and 20% off. There has to be some kind of nexus to say, hey, we're going to give you 50% off because this is the benefit that you're providing to the public system. There are a couple of different ways to do this. The most common approach, and the one that you would likely focus on under the Code of Maryland, is for structural practices. And so these get back to those things like you saw in the picture, which is bioretention, bioswale, dry pond, wet pond, things that you often see in the development process. You get credit for the amount of impervious area that practice treats. And so if you have a stormwater facility or a parcel that is 20,000 impervious acres, and you have a credit for a structural practice of 50%, that 50% doesn't apply to the whole 20,000 square feet of impervious acre. It only applies to the amount of area that drains to that stormwater management facility. And so again, in this example, you got 20,000 square feet of impervious area, 15 of that drains to the stormwater practice, and so you'd apply a % credit on the fee to that area that's drained to it. There are two others that are worth mentioning. The first one is credit for properties that are implementing Maryland National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System industrial stormwater permits. And so these are permits kind of similar to MS4s, the ones that you have, but they are applied to industrial properties that have the potential to discharge stormwater that's contaminated with pollutants. And so there are some localities that will provide a small credit for these permit holders because they do have to develop stormwater pollution prevention plans. They have to develop standard operating procedures. They have to go through training. And so in a way, that's above and beyond. Others will argue, you know what, they only have to go above and beyond because they have a higher risk of discharging pollutants in the first place. So anyways, that's a common credit that is often applied or sometimes applied using a stormwater utility. The other one is relatively new. It's a new concept. It's only been implemented in a couple places. But the goal is to incentivize property owners to invest in small actions on their property that can improve water quality, but they might not necessarily be able to be used to meet that 20% treatment requirement. And so if you can imagine a rain barrel or landscape conservation, or putting in a small rain garden in your property, that isn't big enough to go ahead and meet some of the standards in the Maryland Stormwater Management Manual. And so the benefit to these things is generally the fact that you are making incremental improvements to your environment, but it's also a way to engage residents and businesses in the stormwater program so that they feel part of that. Mind you that if you have higher participation, that means that those individuals are paying less. The program is still going to cost just the same, and so you wind up with higher rates in order to go ahead. And so you're shifting costs in order to go ahead and do that. But this is an example in the city of Falls Church, Virginia. And so the way that they have it set up is that they have a menu of things that you can do on your property. And if you are able to check off the box and you get to 10 points, then you get 10% reduction in your fee. So pretty simple. You can have very complicated ones and very simple ones. You just want to make sure that people aren't taking advantage of it, that there's enough of a rigorous oversight to ensure that people aren't gaming the system. So wrapping up, Hagerstown's not alone. I want to make sure that you all realize this, and you probably already do. There's about 90 other permit holders in Maryland that are undergoing similar challenges. That includes local, state, and federal government agencies. And municipalities in Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania are also undergoing the same kind of challenges and figuring out how to react. This was something that just Googling last week, Gettysburg is looking into adopting a stormwater utility fee to meet the exact same things that you're trying to go ahead and do. We also don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of examples in Maryland about how these things have been put together. I won't go through this, but this is just a couple of examples of how other localities have addressed their stormwater funding issues and then personalized it in order to make sense for their own unique particular needs. So the last thing is the findings of the Stormwater Advisory Committee. And so the last two meetings, we really tried to bring all this together and get a sense from the Advisory Committee, where is it that we ought to think, that we think the city needs to move in order to meet these challenges? What kind of advice or recommendations would you provide to the mayor and the city council? And so the first one is, that you do need to plan for a holistic program, and especially one that is sufficient to meet long-term program needs and that 20% retrofit mandate. The terms equity and fairness came up quite a bit with respect to what the SAC members wanted to see as far as a funding solution. Another theme that came up often was that in order to be equitable and fair, that all properties that generate demand for the system or generate the need for changing the program ought to pay into that. And so based on that, the perception of the Stormwater Advisory Committee was that a user fee approach based on units of impervious area was the most fair and equitable approach to go ahead and moving forward. And likewise, if the city moved forward with that approach, that it made sense for the city to charge for its own properties, both to show that it had skin in the game, but also in order to allow the city to charge other governmental units and make sure that they were also part of that solution. There was a lot of discussion about the impact on properties that have relatively large amounts of impervious cover. And so this is something we just wanted to bring to your attention because it's something that we're going to need to hone in on with regard to how we do that. But the discussion was really how is it that the city can move forward to help those large property owners reduce their stormwater fees. And so you can do that through incentives, you can do that through credits, you can do that through public-private partnerships. And so how is it that you do that? But the most important thing is ensuring that you're engaging those larger potential fee payers in the discussion as we go forward. There's nothing worse than them finding out at the last minute. You want to work with them throughout phase 2 of the process so that you can come up with a coherent strategy. And then also coordination with Washington County is going to be really, really important. So Washington County is going through the same kind of challenges, and this kind of gets at a point that you were raising, which is if you move with a stormwater utility fee, you are charging for parcels within the city of Hagerstown. If, let's say, if Washington County decides to go with a real property tax that includes the city of Hagerstown, you got the potential for Hagerstown residents and businesses to be double hit. And so you want to make sure that you're really talking with Washington County to ensure that whatever you're coming up with, that you've looked at it and thought about it from that mutual standpoint to make sure that it's fair.
Is that under the assumption that Washington County is actually going to implement a fee?
That is making no assumptions about what Washington County is.
I guess that's my curiosity, though, and my concern is, you know, I know that it took them years, you know, just to update to the state mandated forestation costs. You know, when the state made those changes, I think it was like 5 years before they, you know, got on board, so to speak, with what the state was requiring.
Right.
And so I don't want to have this thing in place, you know what I mean, and start this program, you know, and charge the user, so to speak, to make these improvements while other, you know, folks that aren't getting charged are, you know, contributing to that same system.
Yeah. And so and Rodney can jump in, you know, what we know is that the county is faced with similar MS4 permit requirements under similar deadlines. And so, you know, as each elected body starts to wade into how are you going to meet that mandate, this is a conversation that I think needs to happen relatively early so that you can avoid those potential conflicts.
There's some things we'll definitely need to coordinate with the county on, such as public outreach, education, having events together, like stream cleanups, that kind of stuff. Those are things completely outside that 20% impervious reduction and how to pay for that 20% impervious reduction. But we already have some things in the works to get some of these other things going, but we haven't heard yet how they're going to handle the 20% reduction because their number is way bigger than ours, the amount of acreage.
With regard to the credit policy, this is going to be something that would be fleshed out more in phase 2, but the advisory committee was interested in a robust credit program while keeping it relatively simple so that people can understand what you're talking about. And while under the Code of Maryland, all the stormwater practices have to receive some kind of credit, the advisory committee was really very interested in how can use that credit to incentivize both redevelopment in the city as well as voluntary retrofits. And so if you can use that credit program in order to achieve those two goals, then again, you come up with a win-win situation for the city as well as the property owner. Jury was kind of out on the industrial permittees about whether they should be given any kind of credit. But they were very interested in some kind of small credit that would be available to any property owner for pollution prevention activities that they might put in, whether it's residential or whether it's a business. So again, this is really just getting towards the end of step one, and so the question that you'll ultimately be facing is, do you want to move on to the next steps? And so that would involve, again, taking your feedback, really starting to hone in on the program, what exactly is the program going to look like, really working through some of the details so that we can get a much more specific idea on what those estimated rates are. And so remember, those rates that we showed up, those are preliminary estimates. It gives you a ballpark, but there's a lot of decisions that have to be made between now and implementation in order to be able to bring those into focus. So those aren't out there as what you are supposed to adopt or will adopt. They will certainly change. But that's what we would do in phase two, is really get a better sense on that. We would look at the credit policy. We'd really take a deep dive in terms of how you'd ultimately bill for this. There's a couple of different ways of doing that. And then you develop the ordinance. And so we're really here tonight. Number one, thank you for the feedback. They were really good questions, but we also are interested in what additional information you might need as a city council in order to decide whether you do or don't want to go ahead and move on with phase two of the project.
I don't think you can give the public, I mean, it's a mandate. I just don't think we can give the public the impression of whether it's a do or don't, but rather a how.
Right.
Because we're going to have to do this. I mean, the feds have spoken very clearly to the states, and they've said, look, you've been bringing this to us for 30 years. None of you have done anything to make a lasting and impactful change for 30 years, and the environmental voice in the room is 10 times larger than it was 30 years ago, and so we're gonna have to do something, and every jurisdiction is. And so for me, I think it'd be important to understand what the projects are. We see the number 27 million, and we have that average of 60,000, but I think it's important to understand,
What's that include?
yeah, what's that include, and to make sure that we have options in there that give us the biggest bang for the buck.
Right.
By example, if you can encourage on the utility side to connect septic users that are on city water, to connect, to extend sewer utility out there and connect to city sewer, with the caveat of annexation or something like that, that I think is a win-win, because that person now gets public sewer without having to pay for it, and you get the biggest bang for the buck for credit-wise to the person that's paying that bill, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, and that money would not just be for building structures around the community. There's other ways of doing things, planting trees, robust street sweeping program.
Right, I don't know you're gonna get the
planting
450
floodplains.
credits, 450 acres that way.
No, I don't think so.
You know what I mean? So you're gonna have
It's
to
gonna
have
be
those,
all the tools in the
Right.
toolbox. But it's not just building ponds everywhere.
right, or retrofitting existing ponds.
Right, that'll be a big part of
Or
it.
fixing it, I just,
It's going to
those
these
are,
ponds that were built in the 1970s and 80s and retrofitting them so that they clean the water in addition to just flood control, which
and
is how
that's
they were built.
way more expensive than connecting, folks to public sewer, it just is.
Yeah.
The cost
Yeah,
differential
and the
is double.
conundrum is getting a better picture of what practices and what mix you're gonna need is an engineering exercise. It also takes time. While you also need to be cognizant that whatever the solution is, you need to be generating revenue in order to be able to implement that. And so you're absolutely right. But you need to think along two different tracks, which is figuring out how you're going to generate revenue in a ballpark, while at the same time realizing that you need to do the engineering and planning necessary to come up with, what is the actual suite, the toolbox of feasible projects.
So we can work on that, so.
But one thing I did want to mention is, the advisory committee has been absolutely fantastic. Phase two would involve reaching out to the broader community. And so, you know, you're right. You know, there needs to be some understanding that this is a mandate, so it's not about, you know, whether, but how. And it's important that, you know, residents and businesses kind of understand the compelling case about why you're picking one over the other in terms of a revenue generating strategy.
And for me, and I've said it from day one, for me, it has to be user-driven. I mean, for me, the goal was to remove, you cite the 2.9 cents on the tax rate. For me, the goal was to remove this entirely from our general tax supported function and make it a utility, which is what the state, you know, really wants it to become.
Right.
So that's my preference, is that it become a utility, that it become a user fee-oriented, just like other utilities, and that it include a cost to everybody.
Right.
Regardless of
And that's an
status.
important point, is that 2.9, you know, again, there's different ways of structuring how you pay for this, but that 2.9 that is already funded out of the real property tax, you know, that would then not go towards, you know, stormwater. That would be covered under the utility.
Right.
And that 2.9 would be repurposed for something else.
As a homeowner, and if I use that analogy you gave, I figure as a homeowner, you're gonna take $36 off my taxes, and you're gonna charge me $45 for stormwater management. I mean, that's basically what it, as an average taxpayer that owns a home, that's about what the number would be. $12 on a penny, 3 pennies.
Mr. Mayor, I think I think everybody's gonna agree we need to proceed to phase 2. And I also agree with Kristen, the user fee is, I can't imagine doing it a different way than charging a user fee.
User fee, I think, is the way to go. I agree. The thing that concerns me, though, is the thing you brought up about, are we at odds with the direction the county is going? If the county is going to raise county property tax in order to pay for their scheme, and now we're looking at a user fee scheme, we're penalizing people that live in the city.
That'll be
So-
really important.
We need to have
Yes.
that conversation.
Yeah.
We need to have that conversation.
We need to have that conversation.
Yeah, but as a county, even, I mean, they're nowhere near where we are right now, right there, you aren't even talking about it.
They're starting to do some things. They bought a street sweeper.
Oh, yeah.
Setting up some
Yeah,
other
but the
programs.
county's acreage is not included in the city.
Correct. There are two separate.
So we should get a differential from that, or an offset from that, for those obligations that exist outside of the
providing it.
jurisdiction.
They don't have
The
to.
other 8 towns should.
And it would have to be an additional credit for city residents to offset
That's
that
right.
property tax increase.
Okay.
Thank you very
I
much.
think that's all we need tonight. We just wanted to present this. It's complicated, but
You did a really good job of making it extremely, I mean, it was, yeah.
Yeah, happy
It was
I
Thanksgiving.
great.
appreciate your fortitude. I do.
Yeah, it was very,
I
yeah.
want to thank the committee for participating and
Yes.
coming out.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Yes, thank
Yeah,
you.
this is a big job, especially when your job is to figure out how much more money you can charge.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, that was a really good question.
Can I make one comment in parting, because I believe we have some press perhaps sitting here. The financial numbers and the rates that you saw are truly preliminary. When you start seeing them picked up in the media and talked about as, that's the rate, since I'm the one that runs those things, I can tell you that's very conservative and very preliminary. So I want to warn everyone that please don't use those rates as fact. They were to give you a sense of the potential cost to the community.
Thank you for that statement. Thank you.
So the rates will be on the front page of the paper.
See that. I hope you heard that.
Mr. Mayor, welcome.
Mayor?
How are
Good to
you?
be here. Good, sir.
It's good to see you.
My thanks too for Mayor Crampton for joining us tonight to answer any questions that the mayor and council may have in regard to our discussion last week for the additional joint service agreement between the city of Hagerstown and the town of Funkstown. The 30-second recap is water services can be provided through the existing water service agreement. There is capacity available within that agreement to serve the 44.1 wind acres in question. The
wastewater service as preliminary design for the property would be gravity flow to our 21-inch interceptor. It would be capped at 40 EDUs. There is capacity available at the wastewater treatment plant to accept whatever flows Funkstown may provide to us. The rates that would be utilized there would be our existing joint service area rates. There would be no special other agreement rate-wise with the city. It's all through our existing rate structure. And with that, any questions that you all may have of the mayor? I think the question that came up, I believe, was in regard to the unincorporated area that we refer to as Funkstown Hill, between the town and the city.
You provide the agreement here that, that provides the general dynamics of how it will occur and what, what the agreement will be. One of the curiosity that I have with the 40 EDUs is the cost differential. So the average
Between what would be the outside rate and the joint service area
Yes.
rate, it's calculated through our rate study. The water agreement, it's a 16% rate differential between our wholesale customers and what we charge our customer base. In a joint service area, it's approximately 15% different. So that 15% calculation is what it would cost the town of Funkstown if we had the whole property to service the infrastructure that's in place.
So, I mean, there's a lot of verbiage here. And so one of my questions is, in the presentation you provided, I don't know whether, I get it, you gotta pump it if you don't, and the gravity is the most logical way to go about it. But I guess for me, the thought goes a little broader than that, and probably broader than the scope of just simply sitting here on the city's side of the discussion and saying, okay, we're gonna get another customer, another 40 EDUs. Is the joint service area agreement, number one, is that going to be cheaper than if they were just outside city customer?
Will it be cheaper?
Right. If we owned the infrastructure and they were just a customer.
With the break-even calculation, if it was charged at the outside city rate, we would receive the same revenue if we charged outside city rate or if we didn't own the infrastructure at the joint service area rate. So it's basically a wash on that. If we charged them our outside city rate
So in this
and they
case-
did not own the infrastructure, it would be a wash for the city for our revenue.
Okay. So who has the determination, is this as much land that is out there to be developed that can connect to this additional new infrastructure?
Well, we have 40 EDUs, that's our max.
I know, but what I'm
Under
saying.
this agreement, so it doesn't matter if it's
Like
1,000 acres.
Right, but I don't really have a map here that says, okay, a good example is the Martin's Crossroads, probably in my mind, where you go out and you say, you have a measure of how many acres is out there that can potentially connect. Is this 40 EDU, is that all there is that can potentially connect once this line is built? Or is there more undeveloped acreage out there?
There's more undeveloped acreage in the area. This is just within the boundaries of the town, that's why the agreement was
That's why
structured. There
we're not
is
looking to
more
serve
area.
outside
As just the rest of the surrounding area of the city, there's more unincorporated area that can come in.
And
Absolutely.
so, and what is the, you probably don't know this, but I'm curious what the cost differential is, because, Town of Funkstown built a new sewer plant. State came in and said, hey, your plant's bad, you gotta upgrade it. You spend a bunch of money upgrading the plant, building it anew, so to speak, just like every other small town does. Yeah, and so my question to that is, we're going to take on, through a joint services agreement, we're gonna give them a pretty good deal, because you gravity flow, to come to the city plant. So that's 40 acres that we're sort of taking out of Funkstown's mouth, so to speak, that could be going toward its system. And I know that your rate.
I would much rather put it in my system.
My
but
mom
it's
lives
way
over
too
there, so I
expensive.
completely understand that they have a different cost differential, cost burden for that small system and the debt that's on it. And I have to question, and I get it, you know, engineering, logistically wise, it's fine, but fiscally, that's 40 EDUs worth of cost sharing of property in Funkstown's town that's not gonna go to its plant, that could use that revenue toward cost containment of its ratepayers, toward paying down the debt burden and the cost associated with that plant. That's one of my concerns.
Well, Christian, if I pumped it over to our plant, our rate would have to go up quite a bit more to pay for the infrastructure to get it to our plant. So this is probably the most viable cost-saving measure for the residents that I have for the town. Plus, the sewer line and the water line was laid to that property line for a reason. Back when Bill Porter had the property, he made an agreement with the city.
So
I
what's the
didn't come
purpose
up
of the
with this whole
JSA if we need an agreement? If there's already an agreement in place, what's the purpose of the JSA?
I don't think there was an agreement. I think that
I'm
was
not
a
aware of any
handshake.
agreement.
That was a handshake deal
Okay,
why it
so,
was
so
laid.
that
was done back in the
yeah,
40s
I know,
or
there-
50s.
And
I
I'm sure
can't
there's,
answer that.
there's tons of those out there, I'm
Yes,
sure. Getting back to my point, though, you said that the town, so you're saying that the town would have to pick up the cost associated with that pump station?
No, I think that if we put those customers under this current town's sewer service policy, I mean, that's a cost that would have to be spread across all of it. I mean, it basically works to flow in that direction. The lines were laid to that point for that reason. And, I mean, we already have an agreement with you all for the water. I don't see where the sewer is that big a deal.
Well, I guess for me, it's, and again, this is broader than me sort of sitting on this side of the table of the city, getting the benefit of this agreement of getting, 40 more acres of development. It's outside of the city that's gonna use the city, infrastructure, and that's what's gonna happen. And I do have an issue with that, frankly, but beyond that issue, here's 40 acres or 40 units worth of development, that is within the town of Funkstown, that is not going to go to the Funkstown sewer plant, to aid in the broader base of the Funkstown ratepayers for that system. And that I think is a loss, frankly, to the ratepayers of that obligation. And then there's a loss to the city, because now we're going to take on 40 EDU worth of development on the city's infrastructure that isn't in the city boundary, that isn't going to experience any of that tax base. So we lose the tax base, Funkstown ratepayers lose the benefit of that additional customer sharing. And that then begs my question of how much more land is out there where this could occur once this additional infrastructure is then put in place.
I'm not asking for any other land. I'm asking for just the parcel.
I know that you're
in
not.
question.
Then but for me, I have to look at that and say, we have this frankly, we have this sort of whole of development. Some of it is now gonna go, or is going to Funkstown. How much more of it is out there? Because you got another extension of Southern Boulevard yet to go, and I realize that's, out on the west side of the road. But there's obviously more land out there. Are we gonna-
Thousands and thousands of acres. I don't know what the calculation
Well, I don't
is.
know.
Anything that's surrounding the city of Hagerstown that's unincorporated
Well, I think all
could
of that, but
conceivably
I'm
come
saying
in.
in this particular bubble, there's not thousands of acres. In this particular bubble, there's a defined amount of space in that hole that we call Funkstown Hill, right?
True.
That's between this land and the boundary of the city that is yet to be developed. And I think it's important to understand, what that potential is. And to go one step further, I think that land should be brought into one town or the other and accounted for on that system now.
Well, how much of the area on Funkstown Hill do you service now that's not in the city?
I don't know. Just the homes along the frontage.
Okay, I can't understand that either. I mean, it's just, I'm asking for what we have now. I'm not asking for anything else. So I think you have to judge your opinion on what I'm asking for, because I don't control the rest of it.
I hear that you don't, but I mean, I don't like to look at you know, the long-term planning of the expansion of your infrastructure based on one property at a time. And I think that's why the city has, you know, thousands of units of development outside of the city that get the city service now that don't pay a dime in tax revenue to the city. I think that's how we get in these spots to begin with. And I'm just not, I've never been a proponent of giving the city service away, you know, to meet the benefits of those non-city benefiting purposes.
Well, those 40 EDUs, would they pay the same rate as the city of Hagerstown?
Yes, sir.
EDUs?
It would be outside. So for wastewater, it'd be $5,000 per EDU. $2,500 for water, $5,000 for wastewater to come into the system, to buy into the system.
Okay. And then as we treat it, we already have a JSA for water, so.
Correct. They'll receive the same rates. It's approximately 15% lower than our outside city rate. And the rate differential in water or wastewater from inside now, it's about 100%. It's
Still
about
more
double.
than what city residents pay,
Yes.
but less than what
Less than
outside
what-
city pay.
Yes, sir. Correct.
So we're still making more money than we would if they were city rates, if they were a city of Hagerstown.
That is correct.
But we aren't getting the tax base. And I can understand where Kristen's going with this, but I can also understand that it's currently in the city. I mean, you're asking for 40 EDUs for
Yes, sir.
development, right, so.
That's what I'm asking.
Can I get a nod of the head of the council? Were you okay?
I'm fine with it.
I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you all very much. Have a Thanksgiving.
You too, man.
Mhm.
Take care. I'm sorry, what? We're gonna do the classic where, before citizen comments. How come you didn't update this? All right, we're gonna move on to the preliminary agenda review. Also for next week, we have a 6 p.m. meeting, a work session here with Senator Serafini and Delegate Paul Quarterman. And hopefully at that time, we'll know what time our session with the delegation on December 2nd is. Delegate Parrott is again the chair this year of the delegation, and Senator Serafini is going to find out a little bit of information about when the city of Hagerstown is scheduled to meet on the 2nd with the delegation.
It's December 2nd, though,
Yeah.
that day for sure.
It is December 4th, I'm sorry, 4th, Tuesday.
December 4th.
Tuesday, 4th, yep. All right, so 6 p.m. meeting, Senator Serafini, Delegate Quarterman, 7 o'clock regular session. I'll have a call to order. Councilmember Shelley McIntyre will give the invocation, have the pledge of the flag, of announcements. Meeting dates in December are Tuesday, December 4th, 11th, and 4th and 11th, the work sessions at 4 o'clock, and then the 18th is a regular session at 7 p.m. There's no meeting on the 25th because of something called Christmas, so. We have some appointments to the Planning Commission, Christina Davis and Colin Ploskaru. We have a proclamation for World's Aid Day. And we'll have the presentation of the Gridiron Classic scholarships, right? Citizen comments, public hearing to the 2018 Land Management Code amendments, city administrator comments, mayor and council comments, and then we'll adopt the minutes of October 2nd, 9th, 16th, and 23rd. As usual, if you want to stop me, please stop me. Under fire, we have heating replacement for Station 3, Harold Service, Sharpsburg, Maryland, for $20,610. Under fire, we have vehicle replacements, Keystone Ford, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, $61,606.83. Under parks and engineering, we have LED retrofit luminaire for city parks, traffic systems and technology, Manassas, Virginia, $41,400. Potterfield pool improvements, DRD pool management, Hunt Valley, Maryland, $100,457. Traffic and engineering services, Cyber Wang and Associate, Columbia, Maryland, and KCI Technologies of Sparks, Maryland. Under Public Works, we have bulk diesel fuel and gasoline, AC&T Company Incorporated, Hagerstown, Maryland, $433,336, or $1.67.68 a gallon for diesel and $1.5815 for gasoline. Under utilities, we have for water, B84B hydrants, Core Main, Montrose, Virginia for $35,176. Under water and wastewater, bulk chemical purchase, wastewater division, $373,910. There's multiple vendors in there. And water division, $793,728.48, and there's multiple vendors there. Under wastewater collection system rehabilitation, Phase 1A, Mr. Rehab, Inc. of Mechanicsburg, PA, for $207,235.21. Any questions on all that money we're spending? All right, there's no unfinished business. Under new business, we have the approval of owner's consent for annexation of Foggy Bottom Farm and other lands. The introduction of a resolution for the annexation of Foggy Bottom Farm and other lands. The approval of an annexation plan for Foggy Bottom Farm and other lands. The introduction of the resolution for the annexation of Antietam Creek bed. The approval of an annexation plan for Antietam Creek bed. Introduction of an ordinance entering into an agreement for the provision of sanitary sewer between the city of Hagerstown and the town of Funkstown, Maryland. We have the introduction of an ordinance, a quick claim for a portion of LA 5-35. The introduction of an ordinance authorizing acceptance of a deed in lieu of foreclosure for 117 South Locust Street. Introduction of an ordinance authorizing the sale of property located at 441 North Jonathan Street. The introduction of an ordinance authorizing the sale of property located at 443 North Jonathan Street. And the introduction of an ordinance authorizing the sale of property located at 212 and 214 North Jonathan Street. We have the approval resolution, memorandum of understanding with the Hagerstown Housing Authority for environmental review management. The approval resolution, memorandum of understanding for the police academy. Approval of resolution authorizing a financial incentive agreement between the city of Hagerstown and 339 Antietam LLC. The approval of a noise ordinance exemption for Crumpy's Donut Drop. The approval of a disparate funding agreement for JAG grant fiscal year 2017. The approval of an amendment to the city's water and wastewater policy. The approval of mayor and city council goals and priorities for 2018 through 2020. And the approval of a motion to renew citywide mowing contract 3/15/19 to 12/15/19. Any questions? Fantastic. City administrator's comments, please.
Just like to wish everybody a happy and safe Thanksgiving. Enjoy time with your family and friends. That's all, Mr. Mayor.
All right. Lou.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Austin. Charlotte.
I just, with the Happy Thanksgiving sentiments, it's just really, I'm really glad that there are so many organizations and that are providing Thanksgiving lunches and dinners throughout the community, especially since schools are closed and many kids, rely on the schools for their meals. Tomorrow from 11 to 1, I will be at the Salvation Army serving meals. All are welcome, and there will be kids crafts. It's actually a community project between HCC class, sociology class, and the community to increase civic engagement and, increase the conversation between all of our community members. So happy Thanksgiving, everyone. It's been a year since I've been here. Happy Thanksgiving.
Cool.
What?
We survived.
You survived. We all survived.
Kristen.
Gift that keeps on giving, Clark. Not on anything.
Yeah, no.
So I'm going to get kind of serious for a second. Recently, there seems to be some talk about a racial divide here in Hagerstown. And I've been tagged in it pretty consistently on Facebook. I know Lou has, and I know just speaking to people out in public, there's a perception that we are not very inclusive. And quite frankly, I don't like it. And I think all of this kind of came to a head here in the last couple days over the Joe Jefferson situation with the
CVB.
Yeah, thank you, CVB. And, that's not an organization that we control, and I know they certainly have the best of intentions, but the perception is that, one, the Hagerstown, meaning us, don't appreciate what he's done for the bicycling industry and bringing the national championship here. So speaking only for myself, I just want Joe to know that we certainly do appreciate it. I certainly do appreciate it. I recognize the work that he did. More importantly, I think it just paints a bigger picture of this perception that we are a good old boy club, or we are not inclusive of all the great diversity in this community. And people have told me don't take it personal, but I take that very personal. I mean, my mother taught me way better than that. I don't judge people by the color of their skin or their gender or who they love, any of that. And so it's hard not to take personal when I hear things like that, because I ran for office to represent all people and to break up the perceived good old boy club. And I know I can speak on behalf of this council, the mayor, our city administrator, and our staff, that is not the case at all. That is just not the case. We don't intentionally exclude anyone. We don't talk down about certain groups of people. And it pisses me off, and it keeps me awake at night, to be honest. So I'm going to organize some sort of community meeting. If we need to make a committee or a whatever we want to call it to focus on inclusivity in the city of Hagerstown, I am all in. I've been very upset reading this, and it saddens me. No one should feel marginalized, or no one should feel like they're not welcome. So I'm tasked to do whatever we need to do to change that perception and to make sure everyone knows that they have a seat at this table and in this community. That's all I have.
Cool. I want to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving. And, I've known Joe Jefferson for quite a while. He used to run the race out on Woodland Way, that encompassed Woodland Way anyway. And, he had a problem out there at one point in time with a property not wanting that race to be held there. And he came to me, and we worked it out. He continued to hold the race in North End. It bothers me when I hear that we're not inclusive, because the people that I deal with on a daily basis, it's all about inclusivity, and it's about treating people with just respect and decency. And if if people feel like this body in particular and our staff are not about respect and decency, then I can understand how you feel as upset as you do, how I get as upset as I get, and I'm sure we all feel the same way. I know each of you personally, and I know for a fact that you're all about civility and decency. So thank you for that. And it's that time of year to actually focus on being civil and decent. So once again, happy Thanksgiving, and we're adjourned until next week. Thank you.